Welcome students. Today's lesson is about chemical reactions. Let's start with the definition of chemical reaction, which is the process by which atoms or a group of atoms and substances are reorganized. What does that mean? We rearrange them. Still, we are using the same atoms into different substances. Just imagine with me, you have a Lego blocks and I ask you to build home. From the same blocks you can build a car. The same idea, but the home is totally different from the car despite we have the same blocks. And the same thing happen in chemical reaction. During a chemical reaction, chemical bonds are broken and the new bonds are formed, producing new substances with different properties. What does that mean? Chemical change. I think you have a good idea about the difference between chemical change and physical change. In chemical change means I have a new product, a new substance with new properties. Now, after knowing what is a chemical reaction, we need to know how we represent this chemical reaction. Just I give you the description, the definition. Now we want to represent it. We represent it by something we call it chemical equations. What do I mean by chemical equations? I know that you learned about mathematical equations. The two sides must equal each other. But here we don't have the sign of equal. First of all, what is a chemical equation? Chemical equations represent chemical reaction using what? Formulas. Using chemical formulas and arrows. Let's take this chemical equation as an example. You have to know that we can represent the chemical equations by two ways. The word form, and this is an example of word form, or chemical form, using the symbols from the periodic table. Let me just read it with you and to understand. They wrote glucose. For your information, glucose is C6H12O6. React with oxygen, will yield the carbon dioxide, adding to that water, and the ATP, the energy. Again, the below one, glucose plus oxygen, will yield to carbon dioxide and water and ATP. This is we call it word form. And this one is the chemical formula, form. Now, for any chemical reaction, mainly three parts. Before the arrow, the reactants. After the arrow, we call them products. And this arrow means yield. What do you mean by yield? As we wrote it here for you, means it will give or these reactants will form these products. So the direction all the time from reactants to products. Another thing, can you see these small numbers down beside each element? These tiny, we call it subscript, representing the number of atoms of that element. For example, this 2 means we have 2 atoms of hydrogen. What about oxygen? Nothing beside it, so it's only 1. Now, to have a balanced chemical equation, we add something we call it coefficient. Coefficient means there's a big number we have to write it. For example, this is 6O2. Here we will have 6CO2 and 6H2O. If you try to do the math, you will find the number of atoms on each side will equal the number of atoms. Does that mean the same compound? No, we mentioned new product. But we have carbon here, we should have carbon there. We have oxygen here, also oxygen here. We have hydrogen, we should have hydrogen there. But the number of atoms should be the same. The number of atoms should be the same. And here is the same example that I was talking about. In a chemical reaction, we all know we should apply the law of conservation of mass. What does that mean? The number of atoms of each element in the reactant side here should equal the number of atoms of each element on the product side. We have carbon here, we have carbon there. We have oxygen here, we have oxygen there. Also hydrogen. And we must have the same number of atoms but different forms of arrangement of atoms. Now, let me again repeat. For example, this number 6, the subscript, the small number beside oxygen, is only representing number of oxygen atoms. It's not related to hydrogen. Hydrogen has 12. Carbon here has 6. But we need to balance. If you look at this left equation, it's unbalanced. Why? Let me take carbon, just one example. How many atoms of carbon here? We have only 6. Fine. If you look at the products, you have only how many carbon? Only 1. So it's unbalanced. To balance this, we must make them same, equal. So what we are using, we're using something again, we call it coefficients. The coefficients is the big number that we write it before the molecule or the compound, like this. So I have here 6 carbon, come with me to the balanced one, and here I will write 6 as you see. So now carbon numbers here is the same number in reactants, 6 times 1, so we have 6 carbons. But at the same time I have oxygen too, so the number of oxygen here, not only 2, it's 6 times 2 means now here 12, and we will continue balancing. Get it why we call it chemical reaction? Same number of atoms for same element on both sides. And now let's move to talk about the main 2 types of chemical reactions. Here we go. We have one chemical reaction, we call it exothermic, and the other we call it endothermic. Depends on what. If we need to divide this term, exo and thermic, here endo and thermic. Thermic from the term thermal means heat, energy. Now exo and endo, the prefixes. Exo from the term exit, something will be released. Endo from the term entering or absorbing. So we can have an idea about this chemical reaction by exothermic reactions, the reactions that releases energy. Endothermic reactions, the reaction that absorbs energy. Okay, let's go deeply. So as we explained what we mean by exo and endothermic, let's apply it using the graphs. Starting by exothermic, the reaction that releases energy. Here, on the x-axis, you will find the progress of reaction throughout the time, okay? And on the y-axis, you will find amount of energy. Now, focus with me, as I mentioned, any reactions, we need reactants and we need products. Think with me, the amount of energy in reactants here and the amount of energy of products here, which is higher? Very clear, thank you, reactants. So if the amount of energy of reactants is higher than the amount of energy of products, we call this chemical reaction is exothermic. They will release energy, as you see, the released energy. Again, I'm repeating. If the amount of energy of reactants is higher than the amount of energy of products, there is an energy to release it. That means this is exothermic. Now, come with me to the endothermic reaction, to the second graph. Again, reactants here and the products. Let's compare on x-axis the progress of reaction and on the y-axis the amount of energy. Let's see the amount of energy of reactants here and the amount of energy of products here. So which one has the higher amount of energy, products or reactants? More than clear. Thank you. Products. So if the amount of energy of a product is higher than amount of energy of reactants, this reaction needs to absorb energy. This reaction needs to absorb energy. So we call it endothermic. Please take your time to compare between exothermic and endothermic. I found this example, okay, about endo and exothermic reactions. Let's try to answer it together. Here, as we can see, we have 4 different experiments with the 4 different chemical reactions. What we see here, the last 2 columns, the initial temperature or starting temperature and the final temperature. As simple as that. They want us to explain which reaction is endothermic and exothermic. In another term, which reaction will release energy and which reaction needs energy to absorb. So if we look at the first one, we have 19 Celsius degree, I mean the initial temperature, and the final it was 21. As you can see, once the final temperature is higher, that means this reaction releases energy. So this should be exothermic. Okay? Makes sense. Let's go for number 2. Number 2 started by 20 Celsius degree and ended up by 16. So the amount of energy at the beginning was greater and higher than the amount of energy at the end. That means absorbed energy, so this is endothermic. Moving to equation and chemical reaction number 3. We started by 20 Celsius degree, we ended by 26. Yes, you are right. It's exo, releasing energy. Moving to the last one, we started by 19 Celsius degree and we ended by 31. More than clear. Again, yes, it is exothermic. Now, after understanding which one is exothermic and endothermic, very simple now. We look directly reactants amount of energy compared with the products. So the left side here, I mean the reaction, this is exothermic. Moving here, if we look at amount of energy in reactants and amount of energy for products, we'll find the products they have the higher. That means this is endothermic. Now we need to add something. We have to start any chemical reaction. We need an energy, we call it activation energy. What is activation energy? Amount of energy needed to start any chemical reaction. But if we need to compare between amount of activation energy between exothermic and endothermic, we'll find that. What? Look at amount of activation energy in exothermic. When amount of energy in reactant is high, logically speaking, no need to high amount of energy to start the chemical reaction. Already I have high amount, and so the amount of activation energy will be less, not that much. But if you go here to the endothermic, because we have low amount of energy for reactants, in order to start the chemical reaction, we need high amount of activation energy. So again, I'm repeating. Activation energy is amount of energy needed to start a chemical reaction. And that depends on the amount of energy of reactants. If I have high amount of high amount of energy in reactants, that means no need to have high amount of activation energy. Vice versa. If the reactant's energy is low, that means I need high amount of activation energy. Please try to understand it before memorizing it. Now, I'll talk with you about a new concept, which is enzyme. Enzyme, most of you heard about it, which is a biological catalyst. Enzyme is that chemical that will speed up a chemical reaction. Now, what do we mean by catalysts? Catalysts that will enhance the progress of that chemical reaction. How the enzymes work? How the enzymes work. As we explained about activation energy, if you remember before, okay, in the slide before, activation energy, amount of energy needed to start a chemical reaction, so it's related even to time. But when the enzyme is there, the enzyme will minimize the activation energy. So at that time, will minimize the time to have this amount of energy. The chemical reaction will be speed up, will be faster. Look here. Any enzyme, look at this is an enzyme, the purple part. This enzyme, it has a certain site to bind with whom? With the reactants, and here we call them substrate. These sites, we call it what? The active site. Why we call it active? Because this site will bind the substrate. It's like a lock and key. They have the same shape. Please focus. Can you see this shape and this side? It's looked like a puzzle. And I know all of you know how to play with puzzle. So this shape, I mean the substrate shape, will fit with the active site of enzyme. Okay, regardless the number of substrates. I mean, regardless the number of reactants. Now, they will bind together to make what we call it enzyme substrate complex. This one. That means now we are doing the reaction. This action will minimize the activation energy, so the reaction will be faster. Here we will find the products. As you see, these are the products, but still this is what? An enzyme. The enzyme will not be included in the products. It's only a helper. It will help, a catalyst. It will help to increase the speed of the chemical reaction, and it's not a part of a product. We can just apply what we learn here on this graph. As you see, please, the key for the coloring with the green with enzyme, the chemical reaction, and without enzyme represented by the orange color. Now, as we can see reactants and the products, because now you are expert in that, once the energy of reactants is higher than the product, so this is exothermic reaction first of all. Now, without enzyme, so let's focus on the orange continuous line. See amount of activation energy from here till here. But once we added the catalyst, the biological catalyst, I mean the enzyme, see the activation energy now less. That means the speed, the progress will be better. So that's what we call it, biological catalyst, speeding up chemical reaction by lowering the activation energy. Now, students, after learning about the enzyme as a biological catalyst and how these chemicals minimizing the activation energy and the speeding up chemical reactions, now the time to understand the factors that affect enzyme activity. Mainly, we have three factors. The first one, the temperature, the second one, the pH, and the third one, the inhibitors. For temperature and pH, we have a term you should understand, the term we call optimum. What do we mean by optimum? Optimum is the right amount of temperature or the measure of pH that make the function of the enzyme perfect. For example, let's read here. Most enzymes in a human cells are most active at an optimal temperature close to what? 37 Celsius degree. Does that mean at 36 this enzyme will not work? It will work, but the more efficient work will be at which temperature? 37 Celsius degree. That's why we call it the optimum or the optimal temperature. The same thing for pH. What is a pH? If you don't know, pH, it's the acidity of any solution. pH, it's a scale from 1 to 14 to measure how the solution acidic or basic, measuring of hydrogen ion in the solution. Okay, so the digestive enzymes, for example, in our stomach work to help break down food in the acidic environment. The pH is around 2. Imagine with me now the pH in the stomach is around 2.5. The enzyme is still working, but not with the high quality. So the optimum pH there should be what? 2. Moving down to the inhibitors, actually, inhibitors, it's a big subject to talk about it, but I want you to understand that inhibitors means inhibit. Inhibit mostly will stop the work of enzyme. By what? Binding directly to enzyme active site. So when this inhibitor, when this chemical bind to active site, no more space or site for substrate to bind. So it will block it. That means it will stop it. That's why we call it inhibitors. Or sometimes the inhibitors will bind with another site, changing the active site shape. Let me take you to certain graphs in order to understand. Here, we have two graphs. Please focus. The first one for temperature, the second one for pH. And as I mentioned before, look at the x-axis and the y-axis. Now, regarding the temperature from 0 till, let me say, 60 something. This is the chemical reaction progress. Can you see? Starting from here, moving to the maximum at the top here, and again decline. By looking at this, figure out where is the optimum temperature, where is the enzyme doing a perfect work, high product of reaction. Sure, we'll try to find it, and it's 40 Celsius degree for that enzyme. Does that mean on 30 there's no some work? Yes, we have, but this is not the optimum. Does that mean on 50 we don't have? No, we have, but it's not the maximum. Okay? Now, if I ask you here 65, let me say, or 63 Celsius degree, that means there is no reaction is happening. What happened to enzyme? Enzyme here denatured. What do you mean by denaturation? Broken. This protein now no more functioning. Okay, this is regarding temperature. Let's move to the second graph, which is about the pH. And we have something you should know, that the pH, the scale between 1 and till 14, below 7 acid, more than 7 basic. Now, also this is a progress of a chemical reaction with the help of enzyme. We found out that the maximum work given by this enzyme was on which pH? Just you have to draw this line, you will find it at the top, which means 8. This is the optimum pH. Again, the same question. Do you think on 7 it's not working? It's working, but not in an efficient way like on 8. Do you think on 9 it's not working? The same thing. But around 10.5, the pH, that means the enzyme no more working, denatured, broken now. Okay? Hopefully you understood my point. That's all about the chemical reactions we have. Thank you for watching.